Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Spilling the Tea. This time we got a different guest. We're here with Yiska. You might know him as a co-host of the Tactical Crouch podcast or as a journalist for GG Recon, but yeah, I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself a bit.
Hey, I'm Yiska. I have been in esports for pretty much probably 12 years, even though I had a couple of breaks in there. Initially started out doing content for World of Warcraft. Wouldn't really call myself a journalist back then. And then after a long journey where I took up real life jobs beforehand, and then this year is the first year where I've been doing esports journalism full time with GG Recon, and I've been doing also the Tactical Crowd podcast. I think we started in 2018 with that, so pretty much since I think preseason season 2. We do that twice a week. That's probably, if you're from Overwatch, that's where you might know me from.
So I'll just get straight into the questions. From Twitter, at EpicGG asks, in your opinion, are there any underrated roster moves that changed a certain team for the better?
The first one that jumps in to my mind, and that I want to eventually also write on, is probably a name that people won't necessarily expect, and I would say Nico. That's current, or I suppose currently isn't on the Paris Eternal roster, because if you look at his career, like he was in the team that literally won the first ever Overwatch tournaments sometime in 2015. Then with Rogue in 2017, he once again became a champion for like dominating NA for a while, and then I would say once again contributing to the Paris Eternal success this season. Pretty underrated also as a teammate. What kind of intangibles he brings to the team. Just has an insane work ethic and is like one of the most beloved teammates. It's basically, there's this book and Captain Planet, the former statistical analyst for the Overwatch League, keeps recommending it to people, and it's a great one. It's called Captain's Class, and in it, it's described what kind of players make the difference in these long-lasting sports legacies. And if you read that book and know anything about Nico, that's that player to a T. Interestingly, because I don't think that's a name that instantly pops up for people when they think of a very impactful player towards a roster.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting one. I mean, a lot of people have very negative opinions when it comes to Nico. Obviously, there's been a lot of drama with him because a lot of people defending him. Obviously, Paris had a really good season. He played in a lot of games, so obviously he's shown that he can win at every level of the game, really. So it's definitely someone I'd say is underrated. At Dolky asks, would love to hear some coaching talk. Both of you have talked with or worked with a lot of coaches. How much do you think a coach impacts a team? And is it better to shake things up frequently as a coach, or is it all situational? So I'll let you go first.
That's an interesting one, because usually my knowledge of this is by proxy. So when players talk about it, or when general managers talk about their experience with specific coaches, I think that coaches are hugely influential. I think that it's very often underrated when they are, because in essence there are different coaching types, and only the more intrusive coaching types where the coach takes the leadership position of like almost like an authoritative figure is then when people realize what the impact is. Not necessarily when stuff just runs smoothly through a season and conflict is avoided due to the work behind the scenes of the respective coach. So that's an interesting one. I also think there's such a thing as the right coach for the right team. I think that's just like in terms of, it has to be a fit for the org. It has to be a fit with the respective players. It's also sometimes the setup for everything is very different as to how a coach is set up for success. Like sometimes coaches don't have a say really in the roster too much, or they come in late in the season or whatever. Sometimes they have full control. So it's an interesting thing. It's also incredibly difficult to judge from the outside, which is why the Coach of the Year award was very interesting. like the vote itself, judging that from the outside, seems quite hard to do. You can basically just go from whatever you saw on the server mostly, unless you ask around. So yeah, I think bottom line is coaching is very, very influential.
I mean, I think from the outside, even as a player or a coach or someone like a manager on the inside, it's hard to judge coaches on other teams unless you get,
Right.
knowledge by proxy. So I can only really speak from my experience. I think different, like you said, different styles, different coaches can have more of an impact or less of an impact, whether that's good or bad. I've been fortunate to work with a lot of good coaches, a lot of coaches that have very different styles as well. So yeah, it really depends how they take the approach to coaching. But I feel like most coaches at the high level, especially when you're talking about OWL, or potentially even like World Cup, um, can have a big impact in terms of the environment, how things are set up, how things are sort of relayed to people, who's supposed to be doing what, when, and where can sometimes really help when a player feels lost or they don't quite know what to do. A lot of that will come from a player's intuition and what they kind of go and decide to do themselves in the game and out of the game. But yeah, it really, coaches really shine in both moments where teams are struggling and also when players don't actually know what to do all the time because they can give good guidance. And that's one of the reasons why I think you see a lot of coaches are either people that have been in the scene a very long time and worked very hard and in a lot of very prestigious teams, or are like players who are coming up and working their way through the coaching scene as well, because they do have that level of understanding of the game and they can like help players sort of understand that as well. So I think in that regard they can have a large impact, but obviously when it gets into the game, into the match, there's only so much that they can really do to impact the game. Quiz OW asks, what goes into the decision process of what you're going to include in an article versus what you're going to put in the podcast?
Of course, like GG Recon is my employer, so the best ideas should be going there. I also think that we have a different style of things that go into a podcast. I think I would never write about something that goes towards, I don't know, being a rumor. And if I want to speculate, I would very clearly outline that. I think the threshold of what can be talked about is different for the podcast, where you can take a piece of information. I would then not tell you that I've heard a rumor, but would run with the thought experiment of it and just play with it a little and see where the idea or the rumor would lead, maybe down the line, or mix it up with a couple of ideas I come up by myself. So often there's overlap though, where like sometimes I write an article and that topic stays with me even after hitting send to my editor, where I think, oh yeah, okay, so there's still more to uncover, and maybe I'll try to talk this through with the TCP guys, because it's always interesting to see kind of when you bounce your ideas off of others, where you have the feeling of, okay, maybe there's another aspect that I didn't necessarily fully grasp when I wrote about it.
I guess that is sort of like the whole podcast style as well. Like you kind of just bring up these general ideas and like kind of kick them off of each other, right? Like that's always, they always end up with like some interesting discussions. So it doesn't have to be as specific, I guess, but yeah, makes sense. Corbs asks, what are your favorite teams from the Pacific and Atlantic division?
I don't think I should have attachments towards any teams in terms of like just being a fan of them.
Yeah.
Because that would sort of betray my job.
You don't want to have like personal bias. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Maybe it's fairer to say I enjoy teams with a play style like the Shock, for instance, that is very aggressive, where no teamfight seems to be theoretically lost. And that's also why I liked Fusion in Season 1, where it's just like they re-engage and pop ultimates at the weirdest times, conventionally anyway. Makes sense in VOD review often after, but while it happens, it's just what is going on. For Pacific, I mean Shanghai definitely, but also I liked quite a bit of the narrative of the Spitfire, because like theoretically that coaching staff had a lot of success in the past. So seeing where they could take this with the rookies that they had was sort of a fun idea for me to follow. Didn't end up being, I mean, also the Pacific region probably pretty competitive in that regard. But yeah, probably teams like those, not these specific teams. Those are the patterns I enjoy.
Daring Hardox asks, what would you say is the most difficult aspect of building a career in esports? Obviously, I think they're referring to be outside of being a player,
Right.
like in a position like you're in.
I will say, I think it's an overarching thing, even with players. I think the hardest part is getting to invest time into it without being paid, without yet making a living out of it. And you usually need a lot of time in order to invest in esports. Like for me, yes, it was like a side gig most of the time. I worked freelance for the better part of the last decade, but it was never really financially secure to just go full-time or even able to go full-time in these situations. And I think it's very much the same for players, where it's like, depending on what your scene gives you in the tier 3 or tier 2 scene, and I think this is more true now as well, you kind of need a way to sustain yourself through the time where you're still rapidly improving and or have not been discovered yet, even though you theoretically have the skill to make a living with what you're doing. So I think generally it's either based on an incredible amount of work, because you got to do it after whatever you earn a living with, or you're in a privileged position where you got someone else taking care of your income, and you can then fully dedicate yourself to becoming an esports professional.
It's really interesting that that's the point you make, because one of the things that I always say when I get DMs from people asking about like when they're aspiring to become like a pro player is they ask, what was I doing when I became pro in Overwatch? And one of the things that I always say is like, if you're in school, you're actually pretty lucky, because I was in education when I became like a semi-pro player,
Right.
right? And I was able to invest. It was hard because you have to invest a lot of time into Overwatch.
Right.
But you also have to do it into your studies as well. But I was in a very fortunate position where after I'd finished, I had like a gap year where I was able to pretty
Oh.
much do whatever I want, and about 4 to 6 months down the line, I actually signed my first contract where I was getting a small amount of money. Late the next start of the next year, so like 6 months after being out of school, I signed with British Hurricane. So for me, I obviously improved a lot once I was able to stop investing time into school and just put everything into Overwatch. But I was in a very fortunate position because of school and like the way it worked with like a gap year. Um, so yeah, like if people are aspiring to be pro as well, and they're in school, it's actually a good position to be in, because you have sort of an occupation sorted out, but you just need to invest a lot of time, which is the hard part. Thorin asks, which team is the biggest what if in our history, in your opinion?
I would have liked to see how high Boston could have gotten in season 1 had the patch not changed and a leadership change had not happened, right? I think, like, coming from stage 3 with a perfect stage going into playoffs, and had the meta stayed, like, you don't immediately forget everything that someone taught you. I think, like, you guys could have been, or like the organization could have been a definitive title contender. And honestly, it was still pretty close against the Fusion, if I remember correctly, 2-1 in series, if I have my stats correct. So I think that's the only answer I could come up with. Of course, there's others, like, what if Bumper hadn't stepped away from the game in season 3 when he did? I heard he was a crazy good Sigma, so that's an interesting thought coming into season 2 season playoffs. Yeah, those are pretty much my biggest two.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about teams, I think I agree with you. Season 1 Boston, obviously, one of the Titans compared to other teams at that point. So it would have been really interesting to see that if it never shifted. Um, Also, obviously, I can imagine things with the league as well. Obviously, if 2-2-2 lock had been implemented
Right.
during the season in season 2, that would have been very interesting because there were talks about it being implemented a little bit earlier, and then
Mm-hmm.
obviously it happened for stage 4 in playoffs,
Right.
and there was a lot of teams that got better and worse in that patch. I remember notably, I think Guangzhou were a very mediocre team up until that point, but in stage 4 they looked really good, for example.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of situations that could have been different. Also, obviously, Sinatra as a player, I could think about a lot of what ifs if he if he had stayed.
Right.
Uh,
That's a big one, yeah.
Corey too, I guess. But yeah, though I guess it depends what you're talking about when it comes to the what ifs. But there's a lot of
Hmm.
them. F Cap Picasso asks, would you do a race the Uprising next season?
Yeah. Okay, so you might not have seen this, but I think the way you are structuring has me very convinced that the trajectory will be going upwards. Not only that, but I also think that it would be a valuable opponent. For those that don't know, for this season, we did a race the Mayhem. So for every win the Mayhem got during the regular season, whoever wanted to commit to it, I did 1 kilo per win. So you would have had to lose, I think, Mayhem at
A couple
16 wins.
pounds.
Yeah, it was
16. That's a lot.
most definitely lost that one as well. But I was able to fit my suit for my sister's wedding, so thank you for the
that's really
Mayhem
cool,
for
actually.
that. Yeah, and yeah, sure. Like if you guys want to take that challenge, most definitely. I definitely need it too. So
Yeah, I mean, challenges like that are positive for both sides are always nice. Don't see a reason not to. P2D asks, you've covered OWL exclusively from Europe and never been to the States. If you had to move to the US, where would you want to live? And, what would you be most excited about living there?
East Coast because it's closer to home. But also, I think generally I would vibe with that more. New York would be exciting, I suppose, to live there for a bit.
I think a lot of people who maybe live in America outside of, like, from Europe or from Asia will sympathize with that you want to be a bit closer to home because, travel time, travel price, it all makes a difference when it comes to, like, seeing your family, going home,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So, for me, it's the same.
Was there anything hard to adapt to? It was just a culture shock.
Food is probably the biggest culture shock when I moved from the UK to America.
Right.
It's every time it takes me a month adjustment period to get used to my daily routine of food.
Yeah, I believe that. Also, I was a big fan of your video with Jerry, where you guys tried each other's other snacks.
That was an excellent video. Probably the favorite content piece I've done this year, actually. I really enjoyed that.
That's not the first thing that I go to when I think about how appetizing something is. Better than poo, guys.
My company's from the Greater Manchester area, and I showed that to them and sort of to introduce them to Overwatch and feel good about them, and they really enjoyed that content as well.
I'm glad. All right, that's all the questions that we've got for now. So, if there's anything else you want to mention, or
No, generally, like, thanks for having me. That was really fun. I have to keep myself from the old, reflex of wanting to ask you questions. I failed at least twice, so
I mean, I enjoy it. I like the back and forward. I like the podcast style as well. Every podcast I've been on has been a very enjoyable experience for me. So even if it's a little different, it's nice.
Sweet, yeah.
All right, well, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.